So what I'd love to start with is to just hear 1 or 2 minutes from each of the panelists about sort of a direct response to the film and some comments.
That is probably the 10th or more time I've seen that film, and I'm always struck anew, and I always notice a new little detail every time I watch it. I spent some time in the UK studying play work and adventure play, and I spent some time at the Land, the adventure playground in Wrexham. And one thing I learned, and I noticed Dave talks about it, the play worker Dave talks about this too, how often I had to sort of suck in my gut and kind of bite my tongue as I watched kids do things that felt, oh my God, and I'm the grown-up here. Is that okay? And it was always better to wait and see what happened and watch the kids take care of themselves and each other. So I think Erin's film captures that so beautifully, and I know that feeling in my gut.
We discussed the way that places like the Land create contexts where children can engage in self-directed play on their own terms.
This was always my dream when making this film. You hope that people want to see it, and in particular to bring the film to children's museums where there are people who are ready to support children's playful lives in any way that they can. So I really appreciate that there's an audience here today who does care about that kind of thing and is willing to kind of rearrange the pieces of what we're willing to take on as adults supporting play. So I really thank everyone for coming and for taking these ideas into consideration. So the Land in particular, when I filmed there, was one of the world's newest adventure playgrounds. They had just established a few months previous, and they were employing some of the oldest junk philosophies. So adventure playgrounds throughout the UK and the US, exist on a spectrum in terms of what they look like. But I really think that they sort of push, they really show us what the very end of the spectrum is in terms of what a child-built environment can look like, or what it will look like, and what can happen there.
What I've learned, and what I think the Land really shows, as hard as some of it is to watch, is that kids really learn through experiencing the consequences of their choices. And I think that's an incredibly difficult thing for a parent to learn. I think teachers inherently know that. And I think what's so difficult is, as the gentleman in the film says, is the consequences being something that teach them and have them go on in a healthy life rather than them being so severe that they're harmed in some way. The other thing that the movie really said to me is that we as parents and teachers and stewards of children just have to kind of figure out our own anxiety.
There really are two aspects of development that we've tended to neglect. The first aspect is about comfort and security, and you want to call it attachment. But the other part is about exploration and curiosity and taking safe risks. And I think increasingly, because of a lot of cultural factors and other things, we've robbed kids of those safe risks, and I think we've robbed them of the opportunities to develop resilience.
I come back to that often, checking myself, is this a risk, is this a hazard? And also, am I scared or are they scared? Is it me that's freaked out, or is it the child that's freaked out? And I'm constantly asking myself those questions when I'm choosing whether to intervene and how to intervene.
I think a really important distinction that's made in the film is the difference between a risk and a hazard, and that a risk is something that a child might invent for him or herself and then move through and work through. And a hazard is something that happens to us, right? We do not have control of a hazard. In the United States, and I can say this as a parent and as a former classroom teacher, we tend to put them all in the same category. We tend to say this is all one bucket that we call risk, and we need to sort of somehow learn to need to protect our kids from all of those things. So one takeaway for me was just thinking about them in distinct buckets, and then what does that mean, and what do we say yes to, and what do we not say yes to?
Is it a problem? Whose problem is it? Take the time, because maybe it's your problem and not theirs.
Right. Yeah.
Later in the discussion, we talked about the importance of making the distinction between playwork practices and child-centered approaches to education.
Play doesn't need to involve expensive toys or apps or digital. It is common everyday objects that, and the less, in many ways, the less complex the object, the more you're encouraging the child to take the lead in discovering attributes of that object that as adults we may never have noticed. But I think there's a message that that kind of play is really valuable for all children.
You know, at the heart of the land is this is a space for children to control the content and the direction of their own play. And so in this example, it's happening in this muddy terrain, but that can happen just as easily in your living room or in your classroom if you're able to negotiate time, and in plenty of other different contexts, right? It can happen anywhere. And I think that the cool thing is that the change can happen immediately, starting right today, with whatever child in your life. You know, you can say yes the next time they ask, can I do this? Okay, sure. Like, let's start by saying yes one time and go from there.
I'd like to just mention that the adventure playgrounds in the UK, including the land, are usually in low-income neighborhoods, and the play workers are essential to them, so that while the kids are able to like muck around with mud and hammers and fire and anything they want, there are these lifeguards almost, on hand. And what Playcore does is brings that kind of play into the public parks in low-income neighborhoods in Providence to reclaim the parks as safe spaces for children and families by having play workers as adult presence and then a lot of loose parts. That's what you were talking about. Yeah.
I think there was a question here. Yes.
Parents in the audience asked questions about the guilt that they sometimes feel and societal pressures placed on parents to behave in certain ways.
I think what I hear you referring to is permission, right? So the land looks that crappy so that kids know, okay, nothing's precious here. I feel permission. They feel a sense of permission. When you go to your grandmother's house and all of the figurines are dusted and oriented perfectly, you know, you're like, oh, this is where I should sit properly and, you know, not jump on the couch. But when you go to the land, you're like, oh, cool, we can jump on the couch here, right? You can see, it's obvious, you can feel it, you get those cues all around you. So I hope that the film, the permission, you know, kind of transfers. Yeah, Dave is a remarkable play worker. I mean, he's a master level play worker. You saw some master level play work in a master level play, you know, going on. And it's easy to sort of think that, for me, I was like, well, Dave just must be the most laid back guy ever, and that's why he can do that. But really, it's because he's very educated in the field of play work. He has a lot of training, and he's in this very rich, dynamic environment, and he's worked with those kids for many years. He knows them very well. So this is like the prime place for this kind of work to happen. And, you know, play work is a very legitimate, deep, rich field. You can get a PhD in play work in the UK. Those play workers have, you know, various levels of certification.
I just wanted to quickly mention the distinction between how we're trained as teachers and how play workers are trained. Because I was trained as a teacher and I worked as a Head Start teacher when I first graduated from college. And PhD is in early childhood education, you know, like years and years of talk about what it means to be an educator. And then a few years ago, I met play workers from the UK, and together we started this organization called Pop-Up Adventure Play, and we were bringing elements of play work into the US and help thinking about what does it look like if you bring those practices in. So you have to decide and be very cognizant of the fact, in this moment, I am being an early childhood educator. So I may have a decision I'm making about how I hope that this is going to evolve. Now, I'm going to literally like take off that mindset and put on the mindset of a play worker, and I'm going to act distinctly different in my practices. Now I'm exclusively going to follow the child's lead. And I think a lot of times the struggle with teaching is that we say that play is a vehicle for learning, and then we dilute the potential of the play itself, and play work allows us to never, ever do that.
Also, play workers are expensive. You know, it costs a certain amount of money to put a fixed playground in, and then this, you're done. But to have play workers supporting the play, that's a huge expense. And that's the biggest barrier, more than insurance and a lot of other things, is the expense of play workers, which is a problem that Janice is solving. She's really activating public parks by bringing loose parts and play workers to that fixed playground and bringing it back to life. I mean, it's amazing how the kids use the space in ways that it was never intended, but in totally cool, exciting ways. And it's amazing. I don't know how she does it. She's really good.
We do have a short film of Playcore that we can show in a minute. It just requires a transition. But one of the things we can do as parents is like sort of take the risk ourselves to say, I'm okay with my kid going up the slide.
Oh, yeah.
Like, can that be okay? I mean, the slide, how many times do you want to go up the stairs and down the slide and up the stairs and down the slide? So then children will find ways to make their play more interesting because they are so resourceful. So wood chips. When there are wood chips, they're really fun to run down the slide. You know, it's really, you can take a whole bunch of them and shoot them down the slide, and that's really an interesting way to make a slide be something completely different from what it was before. It's just one example, but there are ways to sort of, even when you're dealing with just a basic nailed down piece of equipment, there are ways to sort of safely help kids find other ways for it to be an adventure.
You know, one of the reasons why playgrounds have become boring is there seldom are play workers or anybody trained to supervise. And you add to that the fact that there are, you know, vast individual differences between kids that are using those playgrounds. There are kids that have had very traumatic experiences in their young lives, and that can be very aggressive with other kids. And without some kind of really highly trained play worker to begin to individualize how all of those children can benefit from that playground, you know, you end up with a dumbed down physical facility that really serves no one very well.
Yes, over here. Thanks.
Audience members asked the question about bullying in play. We discussed the idea that when we adults create rich environments for play, bullying is actually less likely to occur.
Ways to address it. One is that bullying is less common than you would imagine here because there's so much cooler stuff to do than be jerks to one another. There's way more engaging things that you can get involved with. One thing, so that there's that. Another sort of layer is when a play worker sort of maybe observes behavior that's mean. The reaction is not, that's enough of that, get out of here, scold, time out, whatever. The reaction is, oh, you want to fight somebody? All right, I'll fight with you. You know, and they sort of like engage the child in that behavior.
I think it's worth mentioning also that at adventure playgrounds, kids come and go on their own whim. They're not like assigned there and having stuck there for, you know, a 3-hour after school block or a 5-hour summertime day or anything. So, yeah, I think a lot of the kind of the acting out is when kids are forced to be together and forced to interact with each other. So I think just by giving them freedom of, and then with the supportive guidance of the play worker, you just don't see that as a big problem. I've not noticed it.
Typically what happens, and it's a really hard thing to navigate as a teacher or a parent, because you don't want to look at your child and think, oh, my child is making that child feel really, I mean, I constantly feel like I have to say something. And then sometimes if you give a 3-second timeout to yourself, I call it the long 3-second timeout. So it's literally like 1, 2, 3, and you haven't said anything, sometimes the kids will resolve it, which is a much better situation to happen. And obviously sometimes adults need to intervene. We have a responsibility to do that. I definitely think that the boredom has a huge role to play in this. And if we find ways to make experiences engaging enough for kids, then those girls that are my 10-year-old's age won't just feel like all they can do is get into a little group over here and talk about the girl that's over there. Because there's so many options that they're all already engaged doing other things.
And they'll be like, all right, girl, get over here. I need help building this thing or doing whatever I'm working on.
While hundreds of adventure playgrounds exist in Europe, there are only 5 in the United States. However, we discussed several ways that parents, teachers, and community organizers can support opportunities for self-directed play for all children locally. We shared one example, Playcore, a summer project in Providence, Rhode Island.
Well, so there's different kinds of adventure playground, right? There's a neighborhood playground, and then there's a destination playground, and a place where you have a lot of turnover, where kids come for the day with their families and then don't come back ever, or not for another week or something. And in a space like that, it would be less reasonable to have fire, to have water, to have certain elements, because you don't know the capacities of the kids that are there. And so in those situations, it's more appropriate to start with things that everyone can more or less handle: cardboard boxes, string, freak out proof materials, tape, things that aren't going to damage their clothes. And that's, you're still enabling the same kind of play, just sort of, on a different point of the spectrum.
It can also be good to start with objects that are things that that everybody intuitively knows are for play, like some hula hoops and some crayons and some paper. For some kids and adults, they need the entry in with something that they know.
Yes. Yeah.
And then, I guess I could also play with this cardboard and these tubes and these strange things that I'm seeing.
Yeah.
In thinking about programs that allow kids to design spaces, are there ways to do more of that in the U.S.?
I think the Playwork Primer provides a great starting point, for like a framework for when and how to intervene. And regarding attachment, yes, I know as I try and execute Playwork in my life, it is just like one heartbreak after the other. I'm like, look at this cool thing I set up for you, and they're like, we have another total other idea of what to do with these materials, and I have to just sort of swallow my pride and let that sort of thing happen. Regarding play like this happening in the school, there's a lot to say regarding schools, but one way that people are attempting to incorporate it is loose parts on the playground. So play pods, just a shed full of loose parts that come out and go back at the end of recess, if there is recess. So that's one way that it's already happening.
I know it's absolutely possible, and I don't want to run out of time. I would like to bring the screen down one more time so we can watch Janice's Playcore in action as one example of the ways that we can bring more of this play into kids' lives in the U.S.
It's very
Is that
cool.
possible,
it's like 3
guys?
minutes long, and you can really see loose parts coming into a fixed play environment and what happens.
This summer in Providence, we are creating pop-up play environments in 8 different parks in the inner city every day, Monday through Friday.
Ready? Yes. All right,
Our pods are stacked with things like cardboard boxes, chalk, paper, paint, clay, duct tape, extremely important. Those kinds of open-ended loose parts, and let the kids have at it. There's a lot of, what are you people doing here with this mess you make every single day? But when you tap into the play memories, they remember in the summertime especially, we just go out and play, and we just play, and we make stuff, and we invent games. Well, that's what we're doing. So rewarding to see children joyful and resourceful and creative and free. I told the Playcore team, if you go by your park after hours and you see kids playing in that park, you've done your job. If it's good for children and good for families, it's good for a community.